if you'd been keeping up with my episodes of late, something you wouldn't do, even I wouldn't, you would know that I'm following two wars. Armenia versus Azerbaijan, and Ethiopia versus Tigray, so to speak. And I got yet another new insight into war via the Ethiopia one today. There are always so many factors interplaying. And when I'm studying something like Ethiopia versus Tigray, or Armenia versus Azerbaijan, it's not because I've got any great interest in those places. But when you study one war, on one level you're studying all wars. And if you take an interest in a culture, like Rome or Greece or Ethiopia and other ones that I've taken an interest, each time you study one of those things, you're not studying those cultures. You're studying all cultures on one level. I could do an episode on Botswana and call it the history of Botswana, and it would end up a history of all cultures ever on the planet, because you would end up comparing Botswana to Rome, for example. Excuse me, someone's trying to park behind me. Move forward a bit. So, now, the next angle to consider when it comes to asking questions like, who started this war? Is the question of immunity from prosecution. My goddaughter passed that one on to me today. I hadn't considered that with respect to the Ethiopian war that's on foot at the moment. Well, right, that's always a factor, as is peaceful transition or non-peaceful transition of power. Okay, immunity from prosecution can be a powerful motivation for not wanting to go out of power. All right, what am I thinking about here? All right, the history of Ethiopia since the imperial age has been one of phases. There was eras. There's a Derg era, and then there was a TPLF dominant era, and now there's an Amhara dominant era. And because their institutions are weak, these before that there was the Haile Selassie era. Okay, so there's 4 eras in a row. Now because Ethiopia's institutions are weak, necessarily, because they've only recently overthrown an empire, an imperial age, in the scheme of things. So after Haile Selassie was kicked out, the last emperor of Ethiopia, well, there was no structure at all, so they had to start from scratch with a new system. So no institutions, not just weak institutions, but no institutions, So that's the situation that Derg was playing with when they knocked off Haile Selassie. Now, when institutions are weak, transitions of power, and transitions of power come along like the tides. They're the tides of history, Like even in Australia, we get transitions of power from Liberal to Labor to Liberal to Labor. 10 years, all my life, that's been just quietly 10 years this way, 10 years that way, 10 years this way, 10 years that way. But our institutions are extremely strong, and the transitions of power are smooth. And each time there is a transition of power, the next power, doesn't put the previous power in jail. But whilst you're in power, there's a certain level of immunity from prosecution, but technically, So in places like Australia and New Zealand, transition of power is smooth. In America of late, a little bit less smooth. Donald Trump, before the 2016 election, essentially promised that he wasn't going to accept the election if he lost. shocking. If he was in Australia, and that's why I thought he was a horrible sort of person back then. And he did the same thing in this election too, the 2020 election, and he's still doing it. But the Democrats weren't much better in the US. When Donald Trump did get into power, that cry of "not my president" went up. And they wanted to impeach him, and all that sort of stuff. So that was, not accepting the election result. Whereas, and now, same thing, And there's even little murmurs about maybe prosecuting Donald Trump, is there? I don't think so. But it's technically possible. When you go out of power, you can be prosecuted. Sorry, my arm was getting tired. I'll move the camera. Okay. So New Zealand, they had an election recently, and the losing person said, congratulations to the winner, and bring on 2023. How's that? Smooth transition of power. Now, with Ethiopia, very weak institutions. So Haile Selassie got knocked off, the last emperor of Ethiopia in the, what it was, 1970s, 75 maybe, and bloody, violent. And then in came the Derg, and there's just no institutions at all. And the Derg, apparently, I assume, were trying to put some sort of institution in place, maybe one you hate, but putting something in place, systems. And but that was just a bloody era, which is a little bit unsurprising. After you knock off an imperial era, look, there was a reign of terror in France too. So if the Derg were bad, well, they were no worse maybe than the French revolutionaries who overthrew the Bourbons in France. The reign of terror was shocking in France. So when you've got probably the Derg was what you would expect after you knock off an emperor and you have nothing in place. And you have to invent it on the spot. But that was one mob, the Derg. And probably due to their violent behaviour and all that sort of thing, eventually the tide of history turned and another mob rose up, which were kind of Tigray dominant. Another group. I don't know who the Derg were. Were they mostly Amhara? I don't know. They would have been a mixture. It's never black and white. But anyway, so institutions are still weak by the end of the era of the Derg. And then Tigrayan elite and Tigrayan people rose up and pushed out the Derg. So we had a transition of power situation yet again. And it was bloody. It was a war, full-on war. And and the transition of power happened, and there was a certain level of prosecution for the previous mob. They were not immune to prosecution, because when you're in power, you're immune to prosecution, you see. So the Derg were immune to prosecution. And after what's called the TPLF, the Tigrayans got in place, and took power, the Derg were liable for prosecution. A lot of them ran away to America, and I think the boss, he went down and lived with Robert Mugabe. So they knew they were going to be charged. All right. So then we had the TPLF era, but the institutions are still weak. And as far as I can tell, the TPLF dominant era started to get institutions in place. So they're starting to move towards what Australia's got, let's say, and doing quite a good job of it, as far as I can tell. And they even got a single-party coalition going so that all the tribes were represented and all this sort of stuff. So, because there's different mobs in Ethiopia. So, the Haile Selassie represented one mob, probably. This probably goes back 3,000 years, And then the next, the Derg guy, he probably represented one mob or a couple of mobs, more than other mobs. And picked on the Tigrayans, for example, probably. And was horrendous to them. Now the TPLF, the Tigrayans in that next era, under a guy called Meles, was trying to get these institutions. I can see he was getting the institutions in place, but it was going to take a long time. I reckon it was going to take 100 years. And the idea was that for that experiment, or for that process to play out, I think the Tigrayans would have had to stay in power, because they're the only ones who were able to push this new idea through, which was called an ethnic federalism. And if there was going to be any transition of power and some other mob was going to be dominant, they weren't going to be able to keep that initiative going. So a flaw in that system that Meles created, that the Tigrayans created, was that the Tigrayans had to stay dominant until such time as the institutions became strong, and only when they were at some sort of level like Australia's, institutions-wise, could the Tigrayans then finally trust the Oromo, some other mob, Amharans or Oromo or whatever, to become dominant and take a step back. But the Tigrayans, there was no way, I think, that the Tigrayans could take a step back in that system until the institutions were strong. And I don't think history can wait that long, 100 years, with one party dominant. I don't think history can wait that long. So the tide of history turned, and just like it does in Australia, Labor, Liberal, and the Tigrayans, their time had come. They were in play, 20 years? They probably outlived their welcome. They probably outlived the glory of having knocked off the Derg, the previous mob, and that became a distant memory. And part and parcel of trying to get these institutions in place, build institutions, is you do have to do a certain amount of suppression of dissenting voices whilst you're doing that. It's not pleasant and it's not pretty. So, they would have had to do horrible things to people who disagreed with what they were doing. Anyway, so eventually, I think, you could see it happening. Some Falasi or Falesi or whatever his name is had a protest at the Olympics. An Oromo guy rising up against the Tigray dominant oppressors. Now, if you're a Tigrayan, you would say, we're trying to do something good here. We have to do bad things in order for the greater good long term, But the Oromo guys, they said, we don't care about that. You're suppressing us now. We're having a horrible life. No, and they protested, And then the Amharans, I think, have taken advantage of that, and they've felt a little bit disenfranchised in the whole process too, second-class political citizens, and they and so the tide of history came, and it was time for a power shift from one mob to the other, from the Tigrayans across to the Amharans. Now, if the Tigrayans had been able to get the institutions strong enough, that transition of power would have been smoothish, like we get here in Australia, but they only had 10% of the job done. So the transition of power has been bloody. Okay, inevitable. And if a transition of power is inevitable and something like a civil war breaks out, who's to blame? If it's like Dr. Abiy or Mr. Abiy, whatever you want to call him, Abiy. He is the Prime Minister at the moment, overseeing this current civil war or police operation or whatever you want to call it. Now, my feeling is blood was inevitable. Something like a bloody transition of power, almost like a civil war, was inevitable. So is he personally responsible? Well, my feeling is no matter who was Prime Minister, if the transition was on, the transition of power was going to have to do something bloody, because Ethiopia's never had a transition of power that wasn't bloody, especially since the imperial era. In fact, this one might turn out to be the least bloody transition of power ever, which, it's horrible when you're in the middle of it. I'm not in the middle of it, but I know people who are in the middle of it, and they're extremely upset, as they should be. But that's because they're in the middle of it. But when you step back and you're someone like me, you look at it and you say, It's actually not that bloody, compared to previous ones. Ethiopia's kind of stepping forward, is it? And the Tigrayans might well say, well, that's just because we started to get good institutions in place. And the extent to which this transition of power is less bloody than previous ones is, to our credit. And, to that I'd agree with them, But the point is, who do you blame for this war actually breaking out? And, I blame weak institutions. It's a country in transition, all the usual stuff. So I wouldn't blame Abiy himself. Whoever was Prime Minister was going to oversee a kind of bloody transition of power. Now, there's this other aspect that, and this is how I started this episode, this immunity from prosecution motivation. Now, as it turns out, the Tigrayans, when they were sidelined because the transition of power was on, one mob was coming up and they wanted the other mob to go down. It was their turn to go down, the Tigrayans, and it's the Amharans' turn to come up. Now, when you go out of power, you lose your immunity from prosecution for things you've done in the past. And the Tigrayans, of course, have done things in the past in their era. Bad things, of course, for reasons previously stated. Well, when the next mob comes in, it's to them and their mates that they have done the bad things too, resulting in death and mayhem and oppression and all sorts of things, and suppression. So, as in the recent transition of power, before it got very bloody, the Oromos were coming up and they were just quietly sidelining the Tigrayans. Now, the Tigrayans, number one, they probably didn't want to go out of power in the first place for all sorts of ideological reasons. And, we had this great plan in place and he's changing the plan completely and putting a completely different system in place, a civic federalism that we don't think will work. We had the better plan, an ethnic federalism and all this sort of stuff. All that detail, all probably true. But there's this other aspect that as the Amhara are coming, forget which system is the best one and all that sort of stuff, and which, what sort of constitution you should have and all that sort of thing. All important stuff. But as the Amharans are coming up and the Tigrayans going down, if the Amharans can completely oust the Tigrayans from power, those Tigrayans become liable for prosecution. Simple as that. And I reckon the Tigrayans were aware of that, and that would have been a motivating factor in them opposing the transition of power. Not just the ideological stuff, So, just saving their own asses. Survival instinct. And I'm talking just the elite, not the people, If the Tigrayans elite had gone quietly, the transition of power might have been a lot smoother on one level, and a lot of deaths would have been avoided. So to some extent you could blame the Tigrayan elite for Tigrayan ordinary people getting killed. But the Tigrayan ordinary people support the Tigrayan elite. So it's always complicated. But, arguably, if they had have just gone down and then allowed themselves to be prosecuted and ran away to the United States or to Zimbabwe and hid, all the Tigrayan elite, all right, we lose, we're out, Bring on the next 20 years and then we'll make a comeback then, which is a little bit like what the Amharans have been doing this time around. This civil war might have been avoided. But what the Tigrayans did instead, they said, no, we have to stay in power. And they had a national election in Tigray, getting themselves voted back in, and that was bound to happen because the Tigrayan people support their own elite. All right, but the point is, Abiy had suspended the elections. He had an excuse, coronavirus. And he had delayed the elections, and he said, we're not having elections yet. We'll have them later when coronavirus settles down. Obviously that's probably corrupt on one level, but he's able to do it under the Constitution, I think. New Zealand did that, for a much shorter time. Jacinda Ardern, the most beautiful Jacinda Ardern, who was up against Abiy for a Nobel Peace Prize, she did that too. So, it's not wrong. So Abiy said, no, we're going to delay the elections. Now, in that period, he could have sidelined and ousted the Tigrayans, but the Tigrayans said, this doesn't work in our interests, the Tigrayan elite. We have to be officially still in power somehow. And they held their own elections in defiance of Abiy nationally. They had a state national election, which is a red rag to a bull. But, to a certain extent, the Tigrayan elite is saving its own collective arse by doing that. So that's another motivation for having that election, because it's a curious thing, because that election can be argued to have started this civil war. It could be the Tigrayan elite's fault on one construction. I don't think any particular person is at fault in starting this war. It's on at present. The tide of history in a land of weak institutions is to blame for this war. It's inevitable, but both sides acted in certain ways over the last 20 years that caused this war to happen. But it was all to do with a country which is weak institutions-wise, needing to have a transition of power and not knowing how to do that without blood. Okay, so I think that's an extra layer on this war, and it helps me understand every war. Because even Julius Caesar had to do that. He had to grab power or be prosecuted. That was a major motivation for Caesar wanting to become, first man in Rome at the time politically. Not for, when he did speeches, Julius Caesar, he said, this is for the people that I'm doing this, But it was also rendering him immune from prosecution. Because if you're in charge, you can't be prosecuted. Because you are the law, sort of thing. You're the lawmaker. Like Donald Trump, he's been immune for doing whatever you might think he's been doing bad lately. He's been immune from that because he's the president. He's got official immunity. Once he goes out of power, technically he can be... I personally think Donald Trump is responsible for a lot of coronavirus deaths, a hell of a lot. But, he's got his reasons, trying to save the economy. I don't know what the logic of that is, because Victoria, just today, we have achieved what's called formal elimination status. No coronavirus. There are comedians over in America saying that's impossible, and yet we've done it in a large population in which coronavirus did run riot for a while there, and we pulled it back. Now, we have been told that that's technically impossible, and yet we've done it. So technically, somewhere like Florida, for example, could have done it. They could have shut their borders like us, put 14,000 state troopers on the border. We put 14,000 troopers, police, on our borders too. And it worked. And our economy doesn't appear smashed yet. No more smashed than anyone else's in the world. Yeah, sure, we're going to have troubles, but isn't all these, America's going to have trouble too, isn't it? Are we worse off? Maybe the Donald Trump economy versus coronavirus argument was flawed all along. You might as well get rid of the coronavirus because your economy is going to be smashed anyway, and then try and recover your economy once the coronavirus is gone. Eliminate it like we've done here. Maybe Donald Trump had it wrong, and Dan Andrews here in Australia has got it right. On the economy, not on coronavirus, on the economy. Smash coronavirus to fix the economy. Maybe. Time will tell. But the point is that, Donald Trump, if history proves that he did something wrong in sacrificing a lot of humans, allowing them to die for a fallacious idea of, this is not going to happen. It's not in Joe Biden's interests to have Donald Trump prosecuted, I don't think. There's too many Trump supporters in America. He doesn't want to do that, Donald Biden. But if he did want to, he could raise a case at least that it was unnecessary to kill that many people, with messages of, don't do what the scientists are telling you to do. Don't do that. That's what Donald Trump was doing, and he could. Technically, it won't happen, but he is liable for prosecution. He might not be prosecuted, but you know, if a few things happen, you know, you can imagine a lobby group getting up that was doing a class action, acting for all the people who died. 260,000 people died in America, and you know, someone might say, listen, 50,000 or 100,000 of those are unnecessary because of Donald Trump's actions, you know, and he'd be liable for prosecution. And you can imagine Donald Trump wanting to hold on to power or having a rogue election somewhere, to get himself voted in, at least in a couple of states, to make himself immune from prosecution. It's a wildly crazy idea in America, but you know, on one level, is that what happened in Ethiopia when the Tigrayan elite had an election in Tigray in opposition to the national elections? Immunity from prosecution. You know, it's another motivation, another factor that goes into what very much looks like the unavoidability of war when it comes to many wars. You know, like even World War One, it seemed unavoidable. No one knew how not to have it. I don't think Ethiopia knows how not to have a war when the transition of power is on.